Good afternoon. This is Gary Sly. It's the Legacy of Handmade Objects. You may notice that I'm in a different locale today. I decided to stay home and talk about some of the projects that I'm working on at home. The cat is sleeping on the ottoman in front of me here. This is my apartment in Ocala, Florida. As you know, my shop is about 45 minutes south of here in Leesburg. But thought it might be fun to talk a little bit about what kind of projects I've got going on here today and give you some insight into a couple books that I'm reading. I thought one of the first things I would talk about is how many projects we tend to have going at the same time. I hear all sorts of theories in the shop. People say, oh, I have to finish what I'm working on before I start something new. And others are more like me. They might have 6, 7, 8, maybe 10 projects going at the same time. Again, I don't think there's any right or wrong way to do these things. It's probably personality. If you're the type that really likes to finish something off and sign it off and push that aside, then you probably only have 1 or 2 projects going. I learned as an administrator at college that rarely did I ever finish anything. It was almost always some kind of ongoing work that needed to be done. And that seems to suit my personality well. I always have at least probably 6 or 7 projects going at the same time. And for me, it's a mood thing. Sometimes some projects are easier to carry around with me if I'm traveling. Others work well in the shop. Bigger projects like at least one of the ones I'm going to show you today, the quilt, really does need to be somewhere like home where you've got everything gathered around and you can go back and forth to a work table. So, you know, I would encourage you not to put yourself in a box unless you like being in that sort of situation. Don't feel like you have to finish everything before you start something else, because really art is about inspiration. And if you consider what you're doing some form of art, it probably is going to work better. Your threads are going to be neater. Your stitches are going to work better if you're enjoying it. So what I thought I would do first is talk a bit about a couple books. I got both of these books for Christmas, and I've been working my way through them. And if you follow my social media, I almost always show off whatever new books I get. I tend to get a nice shipment at Christmas as gifts, and also when my birthday comes around in May. The first one I have is something called Needlework is Art by Lady Alford. I don't remember if I even know what her first name is. This was originally published in 1886 in London. It's a wonderful hardbound book that is printed now by a specialty press in Frankfurt, Germany. It is not as luscious and wonderful as the original version that was published in 1886. She's always referring to color plates, and unfortunately this one does not include all of that. I suspect it would have been an immensely expensive printing job. It only has black and white illustrations, and some of those are pretty spotty as well. But what Lady Alford does is make the argument that needlework is indeed a form of art. And she actually makes the argument, based on some of what she has studied in the 1880s and prior to that, that needlework was perhaps the first art form that humans created. And that maybe some of the other things that we call high art today, like painting, sculpture, so forth, really grew out of the designs and the ideas that started with needlework. Because if you think about it, probably one of the first things an ancient culture would have done would have been try to provide some kind of shelter for their bodies, some kind of clothing. And I think humans are normally led to want to then decorate that clothing and make it special to them, if nothing else, to mark it so that if you laid it down or switched out clothing, other people would know what belonged to you. I will say that some parts of the early section of this book kind of dragged for me a little bit. She talked in very high end kind of discussions about things like symbols and that sort of stuff. But when she really gets to start talking about the different individual kinds of needlework, it's really, I think, pretty fascinating. I'm in the chapter right now that deals with ecclesiastical or church needlework, which is, of course, a very favorite of mine because of my own background as a United Methodist minister. And she traces not only Christian imagery, but ancient religions that came before Christianity and whose symbols Christianity borrowed. If you know much about the history of Christianity, when it moved into a new area, it very seldom came in wholesale. Most often, when Christianity moved into a new part of the world, it adopted some of the symbols and the cultures and the traditions of the place that it was moving into. That made it more acceptable to new people, and that's why Christianity was able to spread in the way it did. So a lot of the symbolism that we find in Christian iconography and in needlework, if you look at altars and banners and all the kind of things that use needlework today, the history of a lot of those, even something like the cross, go back even further in needlework traditions. And I was surprised to learn how much of an influence Egyptian needlework had on what we consider modern needlework in the West, which really starts in the Renaissance. You know that I'm an academic, and I tend to really like research and high-level kind of discussions. And as I got into Lady Alfred's Needlework as Art, I really have come to enjoy that a great deal. The other book that I'm reading right now, this is one my daughter bought for me, is called A Stitch in Time. And again, as an academic, I like this one a lot. The author, Amy Newell, N-E-W-E-L-L, actually did her doctoral dissertation on older women who were stitchers between the years of about 1820 and 1860, just before the Civil War. Very narrow kind of a band, but a very traumatic time in our nation's history, and a time when women over the age of 40, and yes, that was probably considered old at that point, over the age of 40 took up needlework after their children left home and they had more leisure time to work on it. It really is fascinating because she mostly looks at samplers and quilts from that time period. And she does include some beautiful color photographs and some images of quilts and samplers, and talks about what made them distinctive. And, you know, she kind of busts the idea that in past centuries, only little girls did samplers. She has some samplers in here that were created by women in their 60s, 70s, even 80s. And it's really kind of fascinating to look at some of the things they did. Now, there are two things that stuck out for me in this book. First, they talked a lot about something called second sight, which I'd never heard of before, but evidently was a pretty common expression before eyeglasses were commonly known. Once people were able to afford eyeglasses, of course, you adjusted them and you got new lenses to kind of follow you through life. But before they were commonly available, and even though they were being made, they were too expensive. In this time period, women talked about second sight. So as they got up beyond, say, their 40s, sometimes their eyesight would change and they would suddenly be able to see work up close that they'd not been able to see before. And so some of these older women talk about picking up stitching after many years when they got their second sight. I just thought that was a fascinating concept. The other funny thing about this is that she notes in a couple instances where older stitchers picked up the samplers that they did as little girls, but because they didn't want anybody to know how old they were, they picked out the lines that showed when they were born and how old they were when they did those original samplers. So I think that's a funny kind of idea too. But this is a book that I would recommend. It's probably a lot more readable than the first one, The Needlework as Art. And it does have lots of footnotes, and you know, it was written as a doctoral dissertation, but it does read pretty well, and it's a good look at some of those things. And there are a couple quilts in here that are actually quite famous that I've read about in other contexts. There's a quilt in here made, I'm not going to get into the details of it today, but a woman wanted a record of her family, and it gives some fascinating insight into that. I guess I'm already talking too much. One of the projects I want to just kind of talk a little bit about and show off is this piece. This is a really big piece of cross stitch. Overall, I'm going to have close to 65,000 stitches when this piece is done because it's going to be full coverage. This is a panel based on the date of October 21st, 2020, which is part of a project called Stitching the Situation. And the point of Stitching the Situation is that some volunteer somewhere, and there are hundreds of us from what I can understand all over the place, are stitching the different panels for the different days of the pandemic. And the goal here is eventually for all of these panels to be put together, something along the lines of the AIDS quilt or other kind of commemorative works that have been done, and help keep the memory of the pandemic and those who were lost and those who suffered in our minds. You can see I adapted a pattern of the COVID virus itself. I made a pattern of a face mask that my wife had made. I've added some of the stats for that day. 41 million people had suffered from COVID by the time this date arrived. 62,000 plus people had been identified as having COVID on October the 21st. And the death toll is this little red square here. There were over 1,200 people who died on that day. Some people want to forget the pandemic, and I certainly understand that, but there seems to be a good bit of evidence that if we don't remember some of the lessons learned, the next time something like that happens, and it will inevitably roll around again, maybe it'll be 100 years, but it will inevitably come back, some version of a pandemic. It would be good if we could remember some of the lessons that we learned. Of course, the big project that I'm working on right now is my 50 states quilt. And if you follow my social media at all, I'm sure you've seen some updates on that. I have so far pieced together all of the 50 state cross-stitch squares into strips. And now I'm busy doing some border work to tie the different strips together. And I'm only on the second row here of actually putting the quilt top together. Don't look too close. Some of my seams don't line up quite exactly the way I would like them to. But this is for my enjoyment, and I'm gonna continue to hand piece it and enjoy doing that. And I gotta put my needle here somewhere so I don't lose it. So in between the cross-stitch squares, I'm using these little gold 2.5-inch squares for the corners, and I'm piecing them together with this blue cotton fabric to make the borders in between the rows. And I don't have any of it out here today, but I've got a really wonderful, vivid red fabric that I'm going to use for the backing of that. I decided I wanted this quilt to be all hand done. So I'm not even touching a sewing machine with this one. I'm hand stitching all of the pieces together. I'm doing all the rows and everything. Now, of course, it's a little easier because I'm using Aida cloth as I work with these individual squares. And of course, you know, Aida is very even. So that gives me touch points in order to do the piecing. But still, it's a bit more of a challenge to do all the piecing yourself. And then I'm going to do all the quilting myself when I'm done. The basic idea for the quilting on this one, and I know I've talked about this in other episodes, but I'm going to quilt the outlines of all the 50 states so that they show up on the back, and then I'll probably do some kind of fancy scroll work and such in between. You know, I've said from the beginning in terms of what I'm looking to do with this YouTube is just try to kind of keep you up to date with what's going on in my stitching world. And so when I talk about projects, what I'm working on at home right now are these two things mostly, Stitching the Situation and the quilt. I thought I would also just take a minute and show you this wonderful cross-stitch piece that I did many years ago. I took a trip to Australia, and you can see I made a bell pull using some patterns that I bought in Australia. And if I can get myself up off the couch, I'll show you a couple of other pieces that are here hanging on the wall. This is a long stitch piece that I did when I visited Jerusalem back in the 1980s. That's the Dome of the Rock on the Temple Mount. If you've ever seen my YouTube video, my TED Talk video on YouTube, you will know that this is trapunto, and this is a piece that was made by my grandmother way back when, and I talk about that a good deal in terms of her inspiration. And finally on the wall there is another piece from Australia. That's a needlepoint kit. I guess it was a painted canvas. It's been very long ago since I did it, but that's a piece that I bought when I was in Australia. So that's gonna kind of wrap it up for today. That's a little tour here of what's happening needlework-wise in Ocala, Florida at my apartment. I hope to continue to see you guys online. Let me know if you have questions or if there's things you'd like to know more about. I'm always kind of scheming and planning about what my next episode might entail. As I close, I hope you're having a great week. I hope if you celebrate Easter or Passover or any of the holidays that are going on this time of year, that those bring blessings to you. And as always, this is Gary Sly with the Legacy of Handmade Objects. Have a great week.